In Somalia, we have 2.9 million people that are facing humanitarian crisis. So these are people who are considered, according to the UN IPC, the integrated phase classifications, to be considered highly food insecure and food insecure, so that they have different grades. So these are people who really are hungry and who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Of those, about 50,000 are children who are severely malnourished, and we consider to be on death's door. 1 million people are displaced throughout the country. Polio has returned. We have about 193 cases recorded in this past year. 30% of the population has access to clean drinking water. There are various challenges that Somalia is facing. One is funding. The fact that there are other competing priorities with Central African Republic, Syria, now recently Iraq, South Sudan. They've declared, they're about to declare, I think, officially the famine. So with all of these other things going on, it's very difficult in the humanitarian community. The international donor community is overstretched. Also, I think there's something to be said about poor planning. There could have been better interventions or things that we could have done better in terms of trying to create more sustainable solutions to these problems so that they don't occur. In terms of trying to create, let's say, a large-scale social protection or safety nets program in Somalia, so that those people who are currently the 2.9 million people, if they were receiving a regular transfer, they could have been absorbing this shock that's currently happening, which is another issue. The third issue is that we have a conflict, and with the conflict, a lot of farming communities are not able to access their land, and as such, they're not obviously going to have a meager harvest. And then the fourth issue is obviously climatic. We had poor and delayed rains. In the backdrop of all of this, we have counterterrorism legislation, which was a key part of the 2011 famine. The fact that one of the parties to the conflict was labeled a terrorist organization, and as a result of that labeling and fears of being prosecuted, a lot of NGOs, particularly American NGOs, were scared to operate in those areas. Food security and remittances, how do they interlink? Well, first of all, I just mentioned the largest cash response in history done by NGOs. About $80 million worth of cash transfers was distributed at the time of the famine by the NGO community, and that's both local NGOs and international NGOs. This was all done with the MSBs, the Somali MSBs. Without them, we couldn't have done that.
We're talking of a pretty sizable number in terms of remittances to Somalia, which is estimated between 1.2 and 1.3 billion dollars a year that is remitted to Somalia. Interestingly, a recent study from FAO stated that about 1/3 of remittance recipients in Somaliland and Puntland would be unable to afford food, medicines, and school fees if they did not receive these remittances. And many people infer that for South Central Somalia would be the same, if not worse. This is a context where the international humanitarian system really struggles to respond because of the same challenges linked to the counter-terror legislation, as you were saying. And so I want to put that into context. So we are in a situation where we have a really, a patchwork of different laws at national level, which can emanate from piecemeal conventions, sanctions, resolutions at UN level. There is not a body of law which is homogeneous, coherent, clear. So as a result, we have different laws that emanate from different countries' histories that envisage different regimes when it comes to counter-terror laws and measures. And they also envisage different knowledge of listed groups and organizations. So, for instance, for the EU, you have to have knowledge of the fact that the person that you're trying to benefit is a terrorist. When it comes to the US, and again, you're absolutely right to say that the problem actually is with the US legislation, you don't need any knowledge or intent. Just inadvertently benefiting a listed entity makes you personally liable, it constitutes a criminal offense. There are a number of key resolutions that regulates engagement in Somalia when it comes to counterterrorism. They go back to 1992, but actually the most, if you want, the one that the strongest impact has been Resolution 1884 in 2008, which basically targeted sanctions to specific individuals and entities, listed Al-Shabaab as a collective entity, so Al-Shabaab, whoever that may be, and whoever may or may not be part of Al-Shabaab, plus 10 individuals. There's been a further resolution in 2010, Resolution 1916, that created a humanitarian exemption, again because it was so difficult to operate in Somalia, but that was restricted to the UN. So only the UN has this humanitarian exemption, as a whole source of different administrative requirements linked to that, but it's not mandatory. And in fact, it's not been incorporated in US domestic law. As a result of all these sanctions, what we have seen is really a huge constraints to humanitarian operations, because it's created all sorts of risk mitigation measures that have been put in place, and I'll mention some: pre-vetting finance checks, tracking systems, real-time monitoring, verification of partners and partner stakeholders. So imagine being able to respond to a famine when you have all these administrative requirements, all these sort of cumbersome regulations that basically mean that your response cannot be timely or effective, in a context where speed is the essence to save lives.
I think the governments and the banks and the regulators are chasing shadows, because if a company pays someone money, what they do with that money is not something that they're in control of. Although we welcome the government's position on Safe Corridor and the activities that are happening, as a community we welcome that, but I think the element of risk has not been assessed.
I would suggest that in the end this is an issue for FATF, Financial Action Task Force, this is an issue for the World Bank, this is an issue for the G20. Those are the places where this lobbying has to take place. It's not something that can be decided by national regulators. It's something that's decided at a really global level.
One of the last banks that was still working with the MSBs in the US, I guess it's public. I didn't want to mention their name, but I think now it's fairly public. They're called Merchants Bank in California. And they recently sent a letter to all the banks saying that they will be closing their accounts.
To all the MTOs.
I'm sorry. So it's to the MTOs, to the MSBs. And I think they've given them an extension to July 31st, and now they've given them another extension to the end of September. And that's very worrying, because that bank specializes in MSB, in remittance business. Now, what the banks are saying, the issue is that the Treasury, and specifically the OCC unit, is not being clear on regulations. That the goalpost keeps changing. There's lack of clarity on U.S. regulations, and that's what they keep asking for. They keep saying to the bank, to the Treasury, please clarify the regulations. Make it very clear to us what the threshold is for doing this or that. What are the minimum standards? What can we do? What can we not do? And all of that. Treasury basically is responding saying, you know what the regulations are, it's on paper, there's nothing for us to explain further. But in terms of addressing this issue of the Treasury, there has been no Safe Corridor initiative from the US government. They're interested in hearing about the UK initiative, and verbally they do say they want to learn from that and they want to work with the UK government, but in practice we don't see much effort that has happened on that side.
What I want to say is that the US government, the UK government are concerned about terrorism. It's fair to say, and terrorism exists in Somalia. Let's be honest. But to cut off and say this is the way we're going to fight terrorism, I don't think it's the right way to go about it. And if the US government, the UK government clearly want Somalia to be stable, the terrorism not to be there, there's a better way to fight it, rather than to say we'll cut off. In fact, it will increase terrorism. People will have a sympathy for the cause of terrorism. Al-Shabaab doesn't want money from outside. In fact, they don't want NGOs to come where they control. They don't want food to come from outside. Who will be the victim? Why will organization admit the money they are sending is going underground, or they are sending money to the boxes or their banks? The whole point of going through banks is that everything be transparent, and then you can check who's sending money to and where it's coming from and so on. If that infrastructure is not there, then you don't know, I don't know, the government are not aware of, and it's up to whoever want to use that system.
Initiatives like safer corridors, as far as I understand it, are not something they invented to deal with Somalia. This is something that was invented to deal with Pakistan, which is a much bigger environment with a much bigger counter-terror focus, and where the breakdown for, I suspect, Gaza, but certainly Somalia happens, which for even something like safer corridors, it seems a concern to me, that Pakistan has a functioning central bank that's part of the BIS system. Every other country pretty much on the planet has one of those, except Somalia.
Right now, I think the focus of the international community in some ways is wrongly directed just purely on security. And there's very little being directed in terms of institution building. Yeah. So I think that's also where they're going amiss, I don't think there is that level of political will on the part of the US government and the UK government and the other governments to say, okay, you know what, by hook or crook, 2015, we're going to get the central bank issue in order. We have to focus on the now. What happens in a country where you just had a famine and now you're going to stop the lifeline? So you have to think about both immediate term solutions, medium term and long term. And I think that's where the issue, I think, is so complex. There's so many dimensions to this issue that it's like peeling an onion, and you just keep finding out there's more and more problems. And yeah.
I'm sure there are ways to find creative solutions, to these problems. And yes, I agree. Maybe the advocacy needs to be channeled, sort of taking into account what is behind, some of the nervousness, if you will, the nervousness around these issues. But I also find, I don't know, the discussion a little bit, around these issues complacent, around some of the solutions that can be found, can be identified with a little bit of, goodwill and creativity. Ultimately, what we try more and more to do, with collective debates around aid, is to emphasize how important it is that, the response and, the structuring out of these situations has to come from within, has to come from, in this case, the Somali communities, both within and outside. And I think Somalia is a fantastic example of how, resilient people have been despite, the immense difficulties that these countries had, and how, collectively, globally, they've continued to support each other.